Today we're making the Quickie case. There are 4 pocket options and you can skip to the timestamp that corresponds to the pocket that you are sewing. There's different sections to this video. There's going to be the pocket options that you chose to sew, one for the upper lining and one for the lower lining. There's the pocket page, which is optional, but is included as a part of the Quickie case. And then there's assembling the whole case and adding the elastic on the back here. So let me show you the pockets that we have here. This is the pocket page, and I'm going to show you how to do it with either a narrow zipper or a continuous by the yard zipper, which is wider. We have the flat pockets here. There's a vinyl pocket and then 3 square pockets. There's the tool tip pocket, so your tools, like heavy duty tools, can go here and then be secured with the elastic. There's the bulky pocket, so you can put things like thread spools or thread wax or other bigger 3-dimensional objects. And then there is the 3 vertical elasticized pockets, great for knitting needles, pens, pencils, and things like that. Now you can put these pockets on either the upper or the lower, but I do recommend that the bulky pocket go on the lower and the tooltip pocket go on the upper. If you want to switch it, you can. I feel like the tools feel better up here since this part does turn upside down and this part doesn't. And if you're not using a really heavy tool in there like a big scissor, you can probably do it on either side. I find that this bulky pocket nests together with whatever's inside this pocket page when it sits on this lower part. But it's not to say that it couldn't go up here as well. And then these can be interchanged anywhere on the Quickie cases. And then once you fold it up, you have this elastic strap that goes to the back. So you can feature a motif on the flap and you can feature a motif here on the lower part. And one really important thing to note is that the outer case is upside down, see the foxes are upside down, to the lining when they're sitting like this. So it's one thing to really pay attention to, and I'm going to remind you at the end when we sew it together. All right, let's talk about materials and get sewing your Quickie case. All right, let me show you the materials I'll be using today. So for my main fabric, I'm going to be using this Dogwood Denim by Spoonflower. It's pretty heavy. And then for my contrast, I'm going to be using this Kona cotton, and it's only in a couple places. This is my lining here, and this is my bias for the binding. So my main fabrics are basically these 2 here, self or main fabric, and then this is the lining, contrast, and then my binding. And as for my notions here, I'm going to be using a 1-inch wide braided elastic. You can see the texture on there. I really like this, and I always recommend giving it a good stretch before you cut it to the length that you want. This is my 3/8 inch wide elastic for the top of the elastic pockets. And then I'm going to be using 2 different zippers to show you how to deal with different zipper widths. This is just a fixed zipper, so it has a stop at the bottom and the tape at the top and the bottom as well. And it's about 1 inch wide. This one right here is continuous zipper, so there's no stop at the top or the bottom. And it's 4.5 coil, and it's much wider tape. Most of my patterns are designed for continuous zipper because it's really affordable. And I'll show you how to deal with it if you're using a narrower zipper. And if you're using continuous, you should cut the zipper a little longer so that you can trim it to go all the way to the seam. All right, and as for my other materials here, I use a vinyl that is a 12 gauge matte, or it's called frosted, or other things that are saying that it's not crystal clear. I like the non-crystal clear vinyl. And I like it to be as heavy as possible. That's why I get the 12 gauge. And if you search the internet, you can find this. I would suggest getting some samples and testing it out, because you want something with that's not going to crack eventually. But in this case, we're only using it as a window. It's not going to be the corner of bags or the bag structure. We're making a case and it's got little windows like this. You can pretty much use any vinyl you have as long as it's going to be sturdy enough to put whatever you want in the pocket. So if you're putting really sharp scissor snips in there, just make sure you get a gauge that can handle that. I've never had my scissors poke through my vinyl. And then lastly, this is the stiffener I usually use. It is almost identical to Allowance 70. I'm sorry, it's so kind of bright, so I'm trying to get you a good angle. And it comes about 20 inches wide. It's very stiff, but it's washable, sewable, really easy to deal with. And I'm going to do a sample today using soft and stable foam. So you can see it's a lot thicker, but it's also much softer. So we'll do an experiment today since I've never made a Quickie case in the soft and stable foam. All right, let's get to it. All seam allowances are 1/4 inch, and anytime I'm using a hem, like at the top of the flat pockets here or on the elasticized pockets, I allow for 3/4 of an inch, so you can sew them multiple different ways using that seam allowance. Other than that, everything is pretty standard 1/4 inch straight across all the way through. All right, for the elasticized pockets, we need our lining piece, whether you're using the upper or the lower lining, and this right here is the lower. You need your taller pocket and you need your shorter pocket, and then you need some elastic. Now the elastic piece, it calls for an 11-inch piece, but basically you need 2 pieces that can fit across the case minimum. So you need 2 pieces like that. And if you're using a really heavy fabric, you'll probably use a shorter piece, and a longer fabric more in line with the width of the case. All right, our first step is to make our casings. All right, so if you have an overlock or a zigzag, you can finish your edge here, and we're going to turn this 3/4 of an inch. You can press it first if you like, but we just need a rough hem for our casing and our elastic. Now, this top edge will be a little longer, and I just try and keep it as close to being folded over perfectly as possible, but it will kind of rumple a little bit. And that's okay because we're going to gather it with elastic. So here we have one hem, and this one is a lot wider than this one will be because we have the full width of the seam allowance. All right, for our other casing, we're going to turn under this edge 1/4 inch. I'll just use my hair marker here to kind of give it an iron, but you can iron it as well. And then we're going to turn it again about 1/2 inch. We need the casing to be able to fit our elastic. So we'll just kind of get something rough here, and you can pin it if you like, just like that. All right, and then we're gonna sew this down. And we just need to make sure that our elastic's gonna be able to freely move in there. It's okay if your casing gets a little larger or a little smaller. All right, and sew this along the folded down edge, just like this. And now we're going to insert our elastic in both of our casings here. I like to use a loop turner for pulling my elastic through, but you can use a safety pin as well. So I usually put my loop turner in there, and then I'm going to cut my elastic to fit, so I won't pre-cut it, but you can if you like. You can cut your 2 pieces and have them ready. And then I'm going to slide it through all the way where the raw edge lines up, and I'm going to sew across the end down there like that. And then I'm going to use my lining to figure out how far to pull the elastic. So I'm going to scrunch it up a little bit and find the width. It doesn't have to be perfectly distributed yet. We'll do that in a second. But that looks pretty good right there. So let's secure it by sewing across the end, and now we can trim our elastic. Save it for our other one. And now I just kind of give it a good little tug here to distribute the fullness, and we're ready to put that pocket on. And now for this one here, I'm going to do the same thing. All right, so we have our 2 pockets. Kind of distribute the gathers there. And now we're going to lay this on top of our lining. Now, one really important note is that if you're putting this on the lower lining, your bottom will be the curved end. This is the seam that sews to the upper lining. So this is the bottom. And I know that the corners don't match for your pockets, but that's because if this were the upper lining, the bottom would look like this, and you would line up your corners that way. All right, so we're gonna line this up, lining it up along the sides there, and we're gonna put our other one right on top, just like that. And you can pin this down here to kind of stabilize it. And I like to turn it upside down and line up all these edges here. So now these are going to poke out past the lining. So we're going to line these up and pull it over here. And I'm just going to tack in the seam allowance or sew a basting stitch there in the seam allowance just to hold it in place. The first side's a little easier. So we're going to make sure we're staying in the seam allowance. Get these threads out of the way here so they don't bug me later. You want to make sure you're catching both pockets. So there we go, just like that. You can always open up your seam allowance, make sure you caught it. And then we're going to do the same thing on this side. And this side, usually you're going from the top down. So it's a little bit harder to tell, like, oh, did I get this across in the same spot? So what you can do is fold your pocket in half and make sure that you're getting them lined up in the right spot so they don't look uneven, which can happen. Right. A little bit of tautness it's going to be okay because the case itself, when we put it to the stiffener, is going to kind of help flatten that out. Plus when we sew our divisions in the next step. All right, so let's get that right there. And now we can go across the bottom as well and just make sure that you're catching all 3 layers in there. It's going to be about the same size across. Let's get rid of some of these threads. All right, so now distribute your gathers. Spend a little time on that. And there are recommended notches for if you wanted 3 equal compartments, but you can put those anywhere you like. Just remember that you lose a little space along the side here where the 1/4 inch seam allowance is. So if you wanted to make ascending sizes, just make sure that you leave yourself enough space in that smallest one. All right, and so now we're just gonna go straight up. You can chalk it if you like, but what I like to do is use something on my table to kind of give me a parallel line. And when I get up here at the gathers, I sort of flatten them out like this. And I'm going to do a little back tack at the top there, just to reinforce it a little bit. Just like that, and then we'll do one more. And I'm just going up from the notch of the recommended amount. And I just sort of distribute the gathers so that we don't accidentally sew through like a fold like that. And there we go. Now if you put this on the lower lining, you can flip it over and trim this curve now, but I'll remind you when we put the case together as well. All right, for the flat pockets, we're going to need a piece of binding that's going to fit across the long edge of your vinyl if you're using it. You're going to need pocket B, which is the taller one, and then 2 of pocket C, and I always choose 1 of each fabric. The reason I have these alternating fabrics is so that it's easier to see the pocket opening when it's laying on the lining. So if you're using one of the fabrics that matches your lining, it will help to discern the pocket opening rather than having your pocket blend in with the lining and you can't see it. So I usually alternate, but you can do whatever you want, and then this would be my pocket configuration. The reason this pocket is taller is if it wasn't, and we sewed it the exact same size as those 3, when we laid the vinyl on top here, you would see the seam of the pocket through the window, and it just doesn't look nice. That's the only reason that we do it. It is a slightly longer pocket than the other 2. So we make it longer so that it'll cover up the seam and it gives a nice continuous look. All right, so our first step is going to be binding this vinyl. So I always start from the wrong side. If your vinyl has a wrong side, I always start from the wrong side when I'm binding. And we're going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam. You can kind of just barely create tension on your bias. You don't need to pull it, just keep it a little bit tense. It'll be easier to do the last step. All right, now we're going to pull it to the right side and turn it under. And we just want that fold to cover our stitch line. Since we're on the right side, as long as we cover up our stitch line with the fold of the fabric, it's going to look really good. We don't really care where it lands on the other side because that's the inside of the pocket. So just like that. And then we can trim our binding to be the right length, and our vinyl is bound. All right, so now we're going to hem our 3 pockets. So make sure you don't accidentally hem the wrong side of your pocket C. It would be pretty easy to do since they are really close in size to one another. One is just barely longer. So you want to make sure that you're doing the side that matches the width of your lining if you're in doubt. We're going to hem all 3 of these pockets, and you can zigzag, turn and top stitch, overlock, turn and top stitch, or roll hem. I'm going to roll hem today. So there's a 3/4 inch allowance. You just need to use that amount. So I just roll it 2 times. You can iron it first if you like. So we have 1, 2, 3. There we go. All right, let's attach our pockets to the lining. I'm going to be using my upper lining for this one, so that means the top edge has the curve and the bottom edge is squared off. If you were using the lower lining, you want to make sure that the curve is at the bottom, that you line up all of the bottom of your pockets up to when it's all done. You're going to need a ruler. So we're going to start with our top pocket C, way up here at the top. So I like to layer them, make sure I don't accidentally sew them in the wrong order. So we're going to pull this one out, and we're going to line it up 2 inches from the bottom here. And we're just going to line up the raw edge right to that ruler there. And we're going to just stitch it on at a 1/4 inch seam. Just like that. You can leave the edge raw because it's going to be inside the pocket. And now we're going to do our next one. And I usually measure from the top of the pocket 3/4 of an inch down. And you can also measure up from the bottom 1 1/4 inches if that's easier for you. But I tend to not do great at keeping these parallel, so I've been starting to try and use the ruler from the top. So there we go. Now we're going to stitch right across the bottom here. All right, you can set your ruler aside, and then now we're just going to lay that tallest pocket, line it up to the bottom there. And if yours is curved, that's okay. And oh, and we can put our vinyl on here at the same time here. Just line it up. And sometimes I will move this around a little bit to give this the appearance of being parallel up here, and just trim it because the optical illusion is a little bit more important sometimes. Okay, there we go. There we have our flat pockets lined up to the bottom there. And if you want to secure along the sides, you can, but we're going to do that also when we include the stiffener behind the lining. So this is ready to go. This is our tooltip pocket. So your pattern piece is a little rectangle, and there are some notches on here. One is for the fold line, so when you can fold your tooltip pocket, wrong sides together. And the other 2 are recommended divisions for your pocket openings, and you can take those as a recommendation or use your own. You're going to need a piece of elastic, and you're going to need your lining. I recommend putting this one on your top half of your case, mainly because if you're putting heavier, larger tools like scissors, you don't really want it in the lower part since you're going to flip that up and it will put those upside down. But you know what tools you're putting in your pockets. You can put this on either side of the case, the upper lining or the lower lining. So this is the upper lining, so that means that the top edge is the rounded edge and the bottom is squared off. If I was using the lower lining, this would be the bottom edge here, the curved, and we would line up our tooltip pocket to this end. So this would be the 2 differences. For the upper, you line it up to the squared. To the lower, you line it up to that curved edge. All right, so let's fold your pocket, wrong sides together. I already gave mine a press since I'm using this pretty heavy denim. And we're just going to line it up to the bottom here, and we're just going to secure it around the perimeter. And I'm keeping that inside my 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, now we're going to add our elastic. I recommend getting the tools you plan on putting in this pocket and testing what works best, because not all heights for the elastic are going to work as well. If you were only using tools that were this long or this tall, you wouldn't want your elastic way up here. You'd probably want it down here. And if you were using only tall things, you don't want the elastic too low. They might flip out or not feel as secure. So I would take the tools that you plan on using. Remember, there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance right here at the bottom. So maybe pinch that and kind of get an idea of where you want your elastic. When I'm doing something heavy like this, I sort of put it kind of at the base of the handle here, not just down here, but I like to catch part of that handle a little bit, as long as my divisions that I stitched down are going to be large enough for that. So I'm going to say my elastic goes about right here. I'm going to make sure that I have it equidistant at each end. So we'll make it. Remember to give your elastic a little tug before you attach it, just so it's got its stretch taken out and it doesn't get stretched out further. And we're just going to secure it in the seam allowances, just like this. So now we need to just add our pocket divisions, and you can use a ruler again. You know, I have this one here, that little mark there. So if I put my ruler and I find a parallel amount, I can use a marker to mark up here, and we'll do the same for down here. Remember, there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the sides there. So you want to make sure that you don't make these outer pockets too narrow once the seam is sewn and bound. All right, so I'm going to sew straight up, and I'm going to back stitch right here at the top of the tooltip pocket for both of my pockets here. And then I'm going to jump up to the elastic and secure it as well. And I will double check too, and just make sure that my marking is still on track to work. The elastic's really not going to be doing heavy duty work. It seems like it will be, but it'll be fine with just one pass. You can add a second if you like. All right, and that's it for our tooltip pocket, except for trimming these threads. We'll be able to secure these divisions down further once we lay the stiffener behind it if you want, so that it's not pulling away from the stiffener. You can tack it in a couple of places when it's behind there. All right, let's sew the bulky pocket. This is kind of a fun one, and I'm gonna walk you through if you have a narrower zipper or a wider zipper. I'm going to be sewing the wider zipper, and in the instructions I show trimming the narrower zipper, and I'll show you that in a second. So the pieces you need are a zipper, your vinyl unless you're using fabric, and then you need 4 of these zipper ends here, and then your lining. And now this is another one that I do recommend putting it on the lower lining. This is basically because the pocket page is a little bulky when it has stuff inside of it, and it nestles behind the pocket page a little better when it's on the lower end. But you can put it on either side, and you can not use the pocket, especially if you're not using the pocket page. So this one right here is the lower lining, so that means the curved edges are along the bottom. And if you were using the upper lining, the curved edges would be on the top, and it would be the taller piece. All right, so let's set those aside for now. All right, let's talk about the zippers a little bit. So this one I'm going to sew using continuous zipper, and most of my pockets and designs always use a zipper that is continuous like this and a little wider. So I'm going to show you how to adjust the pattern if you use a narrower zipper, which is totally fine as well. You'll just get a slightly shallower, bulky pocket. All right, so if you're using like a pre-made zipper where it has the stops at the bottom and at the top here, I like to enclose the zipper inside the ends. Now this is just something that you can do that's kind of nice. So that means that the seam line is going to go across your zipper coil. You don't have to do that. You can put it up here, and your stop can be exposed like this, or you can lower it down like this. Now, the one thing to think about is when you do this, I would do it quite a ways down, That way when it folds up and you go to top stitch it, you're not in danger of sewing through that stop. And we're going to do that at the top and the bottom. And this one here will be, this zipper here will be too narrow for the width of this end, and that's okay. You can just trim it along the end once you're completely done and you have your zipper all assembled with your ends. So you're probably going to need something like a 7-inch zipper that's stop to stop. That way you have enough room in here to get the zipper and get it sewn across the coil. But technically you only need about a 6-inch opening. You're just cutting it really close, trying to get your ends on there and it be long enough all overall. So I recommend getting a 7 to 8-inch zipper. That way you have some room to play. All right, so for the continuous zipper, same thing. We want a 7-inch zipper cut minimum here. You can always cut it a little longer if you like. If you need a little tip on getting these sliders on here, this is how I do it. I usually hold it, and it is fiddly. I'm gonna make it look really easy, I apologize. So I usually put the zipper coil in one side of the slider here, and then I put the other one in here, and I don't pull up yet. Now I'm gonna put this side between these fingers and this side between these fingers, and I sort of pull the slider off while holding these in there a little bit, just to even it up, because what we want is the slider to go onto the coil chain at the same moment going across so that it's straight and we don't get a little buckle in our coil. So I'll slide it in here, and then I sort of push it on a little bit and then get it going. And I know I just made that look really easy. And now if you get like a really big buckle over here and you need to do it again, just do it again. And if you keep getting it, what I recommend doing is giving yourself a clean cut across the bottom. So I get it on there just like that. And if you find that it's just really hard, just give yourself a nice clean cut. So the one thing to think about with a coil chain is that you aren't putting the coils directly across from one another. They need to be offset by 1. And that means that you'll never get it perfectly straight across. It's always going to be offset so that it can zip up. So try different techniques. Some people like to make this at an angle. Some people like to do it upside down like this. And then you have the weight of, or the benefit of gravity with your slider here. And I can kind of position it. I don't have to hold the slider on here, and then I push with my finger and get it going. And then if that doesn't work, maybe I can still adjust it a little bit. If it just won't get seated on there, pull the other one out a little bit until you feel them sort of start to catch like that. I like my zipper completely closed too, so occasionally if this side was open like this, I would zip it all the way through and then put the slider back on again so that it's closed on top and bottom, and it'll be a lot easier to sew into a seam. There we go. All right, so now we're going to sew our ends. We're going to put these right sides together and make a zipper sandwich just like this. So the ends are right sides together and the zipper is only right sides towards one of them. And we're going to sew it across with a 1/4-inch seam. And then I pull both up and give them a good tug, and I'm going to top stitch. So if I was doing this one here, I like to stitch these together so it kind of gives me a helping hand to hold them together. And then I would put this below that stop there. And I push the zipper together. And again, I would still do the zipper ends right sides together. And I'm sort of pushing that together, and now I would sew across here. I think I would pull this a little higher just to make sure I won't be in danger of hitting that end when I go to top stitch. So now I would sew this across, pull this up, and top stitch across just like I did on the other one. And we're going to do the same to the end, but for the end we're going to make sure that we're getting the length that we want. So we need a 9-inch overall length. So I start looking at what it measures. And as long as I'm in that ballpark, we're going to be okay, because we can still trim the ends down a little bit. We just don't want it to be too short. All right, and we'll pull this up. And if you don't want to top stitch because you're using a metal zipper, maybe you don't want to sew your ends below the stop on something like this because you have a metal zipper, that's completely fine. You can stick to the tape up here. The metal zippers, the stops look really nice, whereas these, they don't look really nice. So here we go. We have our zipper here ready to go, and you can trim at either end to make this fit your vinyl. All right, so now we have our zipper here. Now, if your zipper was narrower than these ends and a little bit of your end is sticking off, I want you to trim it down so that it's the same width as your zipper. So if I had used this one here, it would be too narrow to make all the way across, and that's fine. It means that your bulky pocket will be a little bit shallower, but it still gives you volume. So you're going to want to trim along the length there. All right, so now you need 2 pieces of binding, and you just need them to be about the length of your zipper. So we're going to start from the wrong side of the zipper. I always start on the wrong side when I'm binding. So we're going to put our binding right side to the wrong side of the zipper, and we're going to sew it on with a 1/4 inch seam. You might need a zipper foot if you're using the narrower zipper. And when I get close to my zipper head, I'll just slide it out of the way. And again, you can kind of keep a little tension on your bias. Get any of these threads, make sure they're all poking toward the seam so that they're not a problem later. There we go. And now we're going to pull this to the right side. We can trim this down. We're going to pull it to the right side and wrap around the edge there, and we're going to fold it to cover that stitching, just like that. So as long as we cover that stitching, that's all we're concerned about. We don't really care what happens on this side because that's going to get sewn down to the case. We're only concerned with the side that looks nice, and that's why we started on the wrong side. So now we can just finish on the right side. Because we kind of gave that bias some tension as we attached it, it generally wants to wrap around this edge and fold under, and that's why I can do this without pins. All right, there we go. We have one side. All right, now set this aside. You're not binding both sides of the zipper. Now we're going to bind our vinyl here. So this is the way the vinyl sits. So you have a corner here where it's rounded, and then you have this larger rounded side. This is the side the zipper will get sewn to. So we're going to start on the wrong side. So flip it over, and we're going to bind it from the wrong side. So again, the binding is right side to the wrong side of the vinyl. And give it a little tug as you attach it. I always keep these two separate so that I can control the bias and I don't need to pin it. Lift my presser foot up to adjust as I go around the curve. And there we go. So it looks a little bit like that. You'll always see this little tense piece there wanting to curl, and that's a good sign. So I'll trim my binding down a little bit. Now this is the right side. If you need to trim up this edge here and get it nice and consistent, do so now. Don't trim it down to the smallest width. You want this to stay that full seam allowance so it fills up the binding when it's all done. So now we're going to pull this to the right side. Just give it a good tug and pull it. See how it already wants to wrap to the edge? That's because we kind of gave it that tension. So now we're going to turn it under here, and we just want our fold to go past that stitch line we just sewed. So I use my awl to hold it in place. And once I got the machine on there, it acts as like a helping hand to hold it down. I always stop needle down. My presser foot pressure is pretty high because I really like to be able to pull on things and not pull them out from under the needle. So I'm really giving this a good tug. And then once I let go and it's folded under, it just generally wants to stay there. So let me zoom in for you. All right, so here it is. I'll put it to the wrong side and I pull it to the right side just like this. And I really push it in there. Give this a good tug, push that in there. You can see that ridge of the vinyl seam allowance right there. And now I pull this, I'm pulling pretty hard, and I'm turning it under that 1/4 inch. And see how it wants to just stay like that now? because it's got that little bit of tension on it, so it helps me. And as long as my fold goes past the stitch line, and if it's not, I just use my awl to kind of pull it over gently, we're okay, because this, again, this won't be seen on the other side. We're only going to see this side. So just try and not fall off the binding. In general, your machine wants to stay on it unless it catches an edge. All right, there we go. We have a nice, clean, finished piece of vinyl. Vinyl doesn't fray or anything. We just do this to make it look nice. All right, so now it's time to assemble our pocket. And this is when you probably want to give a good look at the length here. So if your zipper and your ends are going to be long enough or too long, we want to know right now. So we can see I have about a little over 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch. Oh, actually it's a little longer than I'm thinking because my binding wasn't trimmed flush. So what I like to do is find the center here of the zipper, just like this. And I'll just put a little pin in it like that, or chalk or something. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I know this isn't like a symmetrical line, but it's not that hard. You just want something approximate, and we'll find the center here. And I'm just going to put that through the binding, not the vinyl, just like that. And so now we know these two need to meet up with one another, just like this. And then you can be sure that your zipper will stay centered on your vinyl. So we're just going to pin that center piece there, just like that. And we'll walk this up to the top. And as long as we're roughly in the right place, we're going to be okay. All right, so let's start about right here. So I'm going to leave, I'll trim this binding so you can see how much we're leaving off. So I'm going to start about right there. So I'm letting about 1/4 of an inch hang off. You get a little extra to play with just in case your zipper was a different length, or you decided to not include the stops, or you did include the stops. It just gives you a little bit of wiggle room. All right, so now we just want this zipper to line up under the vinyl, and we don't want to see it in the window. So pull it so that you can't see it. The ends right here, this is the only time you're going to have kind of a raw edge in there, so you definitely want to hide that behind this bound edge. So we're going to pull it like this and sew this along. And when you get to some of these curves, I like to keep this a separate piece so that I can kind of control it. And if I go pretty slow, it's pretty easy. If I stop needle down, and then if I need to adjust, I lift my presser foot up, pull this over a little bit more, sew a couple stitches, and do the same thing over and over as I go around this curve. And then it'll straighten out and get a lot easier. There we go. All right, and then we're going to flip it like this. And we've created, this is the baffle. And let's just get rid of some of these threads. Make sure that we're including all these threads in our seam allowance, our seam line, and our seam allowance. All right, we can trim this so that it's flush with the vinyl now. And same with up here. There we go. So now we have our bulky pocket. All right, so let's attach our bulky pocket to our lining. I'm using the lower lining, and I've already trimmed my corner a little bit to match, but you don't need to do that until later. That's fine. So what we're looking for here is we want these two sides here to be flush and flat. So we're going to line this up here, and we can just pin in the binding here. It doesn't have to be perfect. So we're going to line this up on this long side here. Again, nice and flat. Those are our priorities right now, and nice and flush with the edge. And so now you can see this pulls to the inside there, and that's fine. We can kind of push this down. And now we're going to flatten this out. So I kind of put my hand like a claw over the zipper here, and I want to keep all of this over here lined up. So let's get that lined up. You can clip it if you want. And again, we're going to pull this away here. so that until we get it nice and flat like this. We don't want any tucks in the lining, so we want to keep it nice and flat. And it seems kind of crazy like what's going on over here, but that's okay as long as we know that this was flush when we pinned it. This was flush when we pinned it. If we're getting a flush edge here, we're going to be totally fine. So we just don't want any tucks in our lining or pleats or anything. And you can pin just sticking it in the binding only there, so you don't have to worry about the vinyl. And there we go. So now we have a nice smooth line here, and we know that was smooth when we pinned it, right? So it's going to be a-okay. I know it looks crazy, but it won't be, I promise. All right, so now we're going to sew along this binding, the outer perimeter edge there. And I kind of give it a once over, and I sort of mash it down a little bit to calm it down. I'm the boss of this, right? So I got to keep it in control. If you fall off and have to start again, that's fine. You're not going to hurt anything. And I'm really pushing hard with my hand. I'm really smashing this down. It's going to be fine. And we'll just turn and go across the bottom here just to secure it a little bit. There we go. And then we'll do the same here along this fabric end. Nice and flush, just to give it a little bit more security. All right, and let's pop this open. And there we go. We have our bulky pocket. Once it's on the stiffener, it's going to look really good, but we have that volume of the zipper there, and we can put some spools of thread in there or whatever you like. All right, so we'll secure this to the stiffener once we get to that stage. You can sew along the perimeter here if you like, but you can wait till then. We'll catch it then. All right, let's make the pocket page. So we need a top pocket in vinyl. We need a bottom pocket in vinyl. This is the one with the two curved and the squared off edges there. You can barely see that. And then this side has one curved edge. This is the top pocket. And then the other three are corners. This is our top pocket. It lays just like this with our zipper along this side. We need two hinges. And then we need a zipper. So I'm going to show you how to do this with both widths and with both styles and with both styles of zippers. So this is a continuous zipper, and most of my products are designed for this width of zipper, the continuous style. And then there's fixed zippers like this, which are quite a bit narrower. So I'm going to show you how to deal with that. All right, so our zipper needs to be as long as this edge here. So here is our top pocket. Here's the curve, and these are the three corners. Our zipper needs to be this long, so your continuous zipper needs to at least be that long, and same with your fixed zipper. Now, if you plan on keeping the zipper stops or not keeping the zipper stops, you just need to think about that right now and make sure you don't slide your slider off if you cut the top off of the zipper off. So the zipper is quite a bit longer, so I'm going to trim off this excess down here and just make sure I don't make sure I don't slide my slider off. All right, here we go. All right, so now the first step is going to be binding this straight edge here. Here's the curved edge. We're going to bind this straight edge here. And I always start on the wrong side. So if your vinyl has a wrong side, I always start on the wrong side, and we're going to put our binding right side to the wrong side of this piece. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. And I like to put a little tension on that bias when I'm attaching it so that when it turns to the right side, it's a little easier to roll under. All right, so now we're going to turn it to the right side and we're going to roll it under. And we just want that fold to cover that stitch line. This will go, the back side will be on the inside of the pocket. There we go. So now we have our curved edge here, and then we have our three corners still. So we can trim our bias to be flush with our edges. We lay this on top of the zipper and sew it so that the zipper is going up to this top edge here where the curve is. So I usually start from the bottom, and I line my binding up so that I line my zipper up so that I don't see the zipper underneath. And I'm going to show you on the wider zipper in just a second. So this is the narrower one. If you need a zipper foot, go for it. I tend to find that on a narrower zipper, my foot will ride along the coil, and on the wider one, it sits right next to it. All right, so I'm gonna get my zipper slider out of the way. And now I'm gonna go the other way. And I still gotta be careful. I still have live coil. I can sew across the bottom if I wanna make sure I don't lose my slider. There we go. Now, if I was doing the wider continuous zipper, same thing, I want the zipper pointing up, going that way. I start from the bottom and I lay my top pocket on top so that I can't see the zipper poking out through here. And we'll pull our slider out of the way. Now we know if we lose our slider on this one, we can add it again. There we go, just like that. And we can trim our zipper flush again. Just like that. All right, so now we're ready to put our pocket together. So you're gonna put your top pocket on your under pocket. Now, this is when you may need to trim some of your pockets. So you can see how this zipper is a lot shorter as opposed to this one here where it'll be the exact same width there. So this one, because it's too short or it's too small, we'll need to trim this side down to be flush with our zipper. Make sure that you have it on here lined up with this edge over here. Clip this so that stays put. And now I could take this to the table and trim off this edge with my rotary knife or just sit here and do it with my scissors. And we're going for kind of keeping that curved edge there. It'll naturally get curved when we bind it though, because when we turn a corner, we can't make it a 90-degree angle. All right, so there we go. Now we have it trimmed and I did pretty good keeping the curve. Not too bad. My zipper tape will get trimmed off as well. All right, so now we're going to add our hinge. So we're going to put our hinge right sides together with the pocket page in between, just like this, like a little sandwich. And you'll find that this hinge will be a little bit long for the seam if you had to trim your vinyl to match your zipper width. So line up your hinge right sides together with the page in between, and we're going to sew along this edge 1/4 inch. Just like that. And we're going to pull these down really firmly. My fabric's pretty thick. And I'm going to top stitch it. Now if you're a little worried about a zipper stop or you're using a metal zipper, just be careful with this top stitch step. This will make it nice and flat, especially for my fabric, which is pretty thick. There we go. And you can see that this one's hanging off a little bit more and this one's flush. So we can trim off these little points, that's fine. And on this side here, we'll just cut it so that the base right here lines up to the vinyl. So we're going from this point to where the vinyl is, or you can do it parallel is fine as well. Like that. And now this one's ready to bind around the perimeter. So we're going to start from the back side of the pocket page, and we're going to sew this on right side to the wrong side of the page, all the way around. And I'm keeping a little bit of tension on my bias here. And as I go around the curves, just do your best. I know those curves are a little funny. I try and maintain my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I keep my layers separate. If you want to pin it or clip it, you can, but I like to keep it separate, and I just kind of walk around. So I do a couple stitches, lift my presser foot, keep my needle down, rotate my piece here, and I sometimes will pull the binding to the vinyl edge, which I know is really hard to see. Do a couple more stitches and do the same thing, pull it around. And just keep it lined up best I can. And here we are at this other end. I do have stops I have to worry about. And we'll curve around. I'm going to pull my zipper slider out of the way. And now we're sort of home free here with a nice straight length. I'm pushing my zipper in. See how it was pulling away here? I'm pushing it back in. And once I get a little further, I can pull the slider up and get it to zip up and stay a little bit more tame. All right, so here we are. We're on the home stretch here. There we go. Let's trim the binding off. All right, we can trim this curve here. So don't trim your seam allowances down as if you're trying to get rid of them. You want to keep the seam allowances a nice even amount all the way around so that it fills up the binding. We want the binding to look nice and even and crisp. So sometimes these corners, I need to trim them a little bit, even if they are the correct seam allowance. It's just that it'll be a little easier because of the curve. And this doesn't look that great. It's okay. It will once we're done with the binding. All right, and here, down here with this thickness, I definitely want to make sure I'm keeping that seam allowance. All right, so now we're going to pull the binding to the right side, and you can be pretty firm with it, especially on these curves. I'm going to push my thumb in there and really seat it in there so that I have a nice, even amount all the way around. Now we're going to turn the binding and fold it under so that it covers up that stitch line we just sewed there. If you want to clip it, you can clip it. I use the machine to kind of help me and my awl. And because I had tension on the bias, it'll help kind of pull and tuck it under a little bit. So I'm just sitting here arranging that fold to line up just past my stitch line. I'm going to use my awl to pull it when it's not quite reaching. The bias is stretchy, so it's pretty forgiving for that. And go up this side. And now when I get to these corners, I pull pretty firmly. I stick my fingers in there and pull and sort of seat it in there. And you can see how I folded under the binding there. And it's nice and clean sitting there. And if I do that, it'll naturally want to curve around this corner here. And I'm very firm with it. All right, so here we are close to the zipper pull. We're gonna pull it down. I'm gonna try and avoid these zipper stops. And then turn this under here. And again, here's this corner. You see now the binding is flat right now. And now I'm gonna pull it and fold it at the same time. And now it wants to sort of snap into place there. Let's get this sort of geared up here. Pull, 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 fold under, lay down. I don't want it to go too far, so that's why I stick my finger in there and push it away, and then I take the fold with my awl and place it on top of the seam where I want it to go, sort of tricking it. There we go. That looks really cute. Very picnicky. All right, now we can trim our binding to be flush with the bottom of the hinge, and now your pocket page is ready to go inside of your Quickie case. All right, time to make sense of this and start assembling our case. So you should have a pocket page, you should have a lower lining with a pocket, an upper lining with a pocket, and then you're also going to need whatever stiffener that you chose so that we can sew it together. First thing we're going to do is we're going to sew our lining together with our pocket page. So the upper lining is the taller one, so we're going to lay that down first. We're going to put our pocket page centered along this short seam here, and we're going to put our lower lining right sides together, that other straight edge, just like that. We're making a pocket page sandwich, and we're going to sew this seam using 1/4 inch seam allowance. You really want to make sure that pocket page gets in the center because you need space on either side of it for the binding. This edge was your double notched edge. All right, so now we're going to fold this down, and we're going to lay this on top of your stiffener here. Just like this. We're going to line up all the edges, and we're going to press the seam allowance toward the lower lining of the seam we just sewed. So take a second to get this all squared up best you can. It's okay if the stiffener isn't like the perfect length. It might be a little bit too long. And now we're going to top stitch this seam straight through this stiffener. This is going to kind of give it some stability for when it's folding in half. All right, we're going to stitch down through all those layers, just like that. All right, so once you have your lining to your stiffener, there's two things that you might need to do or want to do. You might need to trim the corners of any of your pockets to match the curve of the stiffener or the lining. And the last thing you might want to do, besides top stitching your seam here all the way through all layers, is if you want to give a little bit more stability of the lining to the stiffener, now is the time to do this. And so like on these pockets here, maybe I would want to tack them at the top of each division. And I would do that now while I don't have the main fabric behind it. So I can just give it a little tack. And I think some of the pockets I think that would really benefit from this are the tooltip pocket, because it'll give the tools a little bit more stability against the case. Maybe these right here, but for the most part, I think that if you don't do that, you're gonna be fine. I rarely do that myself. So those are the two things. So just round your corners and stabilize anything else that you want. This is a good time to add a label if you want one on the lining side of your case. Sometimes I put it right here. Sometimes I'll put it up here, but this is the time to add it. So if you want it on the inside, I would do so now. And we're going to line up this edge here. And I'll keep mine out of the way over here. And now you can tack your lining down to the perimeter of the stiffener just in a few places. You don't have to do it all the way around because we're going to also add our main fabric piece, and we can do it again then. We're just trying to secure it in a few places. I like to do it around the corners and keep it to the inside of the seam allowance. Just like that. All right, so now we're going to get our outer case, and we're going to sew this right sides together again with this double notched seam down here. I'm going to press the seam up toward the upper lining. This way we'll offset it with the one on the lining. Let's top stitch that all the way through. If your fabric's super thick, you can press it open. You don't have to top stitch it at all. I just am wanting it to be really stable. All right, so now we're going to put these two together. So notice that my seams right here line up to each other. And we're going to lay this on the back here. Your main fabric will be upside down to you, right? And your lining will be right side up, just like that. That's correct. It's a little mind bending, I know, but once you see it in action, it'll make sense because we're going to fold this up like this, and there's our little fox faces, and we're going to fold this down, and there's our fox again. So it's kind of mind bending that both of these will be right side up when it turns to the other side. All right, so now is a good time again to stabilize this to the stiffener. You can go all the way around if you want. You don't have to. If you want to stitch it all the way around the perimeter, I recommend starting and stopping occasionally so that your lining doesn't shift and get tucks in it or anything. So I'll go for a little bit, and then sometimes I'll stop, and then I'll pick up and start again and go a little further, just to sort of keep that lining from shifting. Because one of the things to think about is that when we have the stiffener in there and we have all this thickness, even though all three of these layers ideally are exactly the same shape and size, they will not fit like that in the end, because when we're folding it, the inside ideally would be a smaller piece, and then the stiffener would be slightly larger, and then the outer piece would be just slightly larger than that. They would all three be slightly different from one another, but it's pretty hard to calculate that for multiple different fabrics. So we just use it and tolerate the differences the best we can. So here's a really good example when you have this really long stretch of lining, especially with a tooltip pocket. I'm going to sew for a bit, stop, make sure it's arranged, and start again. I don't want that lining to slide and become in tucks. I don't want it to get any tucks on the seam there. And I'm kind of pulling with my hand along the edge here to sort of keep it from doing that as well. Plus, if we went up this side and we're going down this side, you don't want it to get sort of off kilter. So I'm constantly pulling it up to combat that. Pull your pocket page out of the way. It's good practice for when you're binding. All right, and then we just have this little bit here. And I'm using my awl because the bulky pocket does make it act a little bit weird. There we go. All right, let's get rid of any threads that we don't want to immortalize. All right, so now the last two steps before we bind and finish is to add your elastic, and if you wanted your label on the outside, now is the time to add it. So I'll give you a couple of ideas. So when your case is folded, it's gonna look like this. So sometimes putting it back here or under your flap or even right above your elastic are all good options. All right, so now let's add the elastic. So make sure you unfold it. Find your notches on this flap here. We're gonna stitch the elastic really close to the 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so give your elastic a good tug. And now we're gonna fold up our case, getting your first previews of what your case looked like. All right, so now take the elastic and wrap it to the back like this. And you wanna pull it pretty snug and figure out how long this elastic needs to be. So make sure it's directly across from itself. And you want this to be a 1/2 inch past the edge here because it's going to tuck into the binding seam there. Just like, see how this is folding back on itself? So pretty snug, but don't pull too hard because it's not full yet. So let's trim this. That. And now we're going to sew it on and make sure it's directly across from itself here. Make sure your notches, like because we sewed down, going down one side and up the other, the notches didn't get off kilter. The priority here is that you have a nice even piece of elastic here. And again, stitch this really close to the seam and make sure it's really secure. We're gonna stitch it a couple more times with the binding. All right, so here we go. Here's our elastic loop. And now we are ready to bind and finish our case. All right, so we're gonna start from the inside of the case. I always start right below the seam here. So I'm gonna fold this back, like 3/4 inch tail, and I'm gonna put it under my label. I don't need to do it across the top because it'll just make it thicker. So just a little bit below. And we're gonna sew our binding to the perimeter. You can clip it if you like, but I tend to find it's a little easier to hold it as separate layers as I go. So now you can see I'm bending this up, and that's because it's hitting the table in front of me. So if you have that problem, you can always, clip this so that it's not bugging you too much. Just try and manage that and keep it from bumping into things because you don't want it to pull the case along while you're sewing because it can get a little dangerous. So, all right, so I hold my binding up. I'm putting very little tension on it. And we're just gonna sew around and see I'm pushing this down. I'm letting it know I'm the boss here and I want this nice and flat and I don't want it to bully my binding at all. All right, and so here's our first corner. So again, I kind of lift it up, stop needle down, lift my presser foot up, adjust a little bit, sew a couple more stitches, do the same thing, needle down, presser foot up, adjust. And when we get to this corner, same thing, needle down, presser foot up, adjust. Just a couple stitches, needle down, presser foot up, couple stitches. Make sure no threads sneak in there. And now you have a little breather of a nice long seam. I do see a thread in here, so let's try and get rid of it now because some of these are really hard to remove later. There we go. Make sure your slider doesn't bounce under your needle. All right, and now we'll probably need to clip the other end. Okay, we're approaching the pocket page. Now you need to pull this out of the way. You don't want to accidentally catch it in the seam here. So pull it out of the way. You can even flip it up if you're far enough. But I'm gonna go for a little bit, and now I'm gonna flip it out of the way. Okay, now I'm gonna clip this so that it stays out of my way. Now make sure your elastic doesn't sneak under the needle, so pull it out of the way. The first one usually is okay, it's just the second side that gets pushed over, but double check when you do this one too, that it didn't get snuck under there. Giving it a little tug, making sure. All right, so now we're here at the beginning. Here's our turn back, and we're just gonna lay this binding flat, and we're gonna sew to that turn back amount, so that 3/4 inch turn back, and we're gonna cut our binding flush with that turned back amount there, just like that. All right, so now let's look it over. So now remember I was saying about keeping your seam for your elastic and your binding really close. This is what I mean. So we want this binding here. When we end up doing this, we want to sew the binding really close to the edge here. Otherwise, if we sew our binding like right here, when we pull our elastic around, it'll bend back the edge of the binding there. And I'll show you a little better. I know my elastic's really dark. All right, so now let's look this over. And we want to trim any of this little excess sticking out. We want a nice, even seam allowance. We don't want it trimmed down small. We just want it even. That's the key here. So I use my sturdier scissors and I go around and trim it down to a nice, even seam allowance. All right, we're gonna pull this to the right side. Be really firm about it and give it a good tug all the way down. So we're gonna pull this just like this and push it in there really good. Like just push it in those corners really good. All right, and look it over because this is our last step. All right, so now I'm gonna go near where I started right here. And if this is feeling fiddly here, I will start sort of away from it, like especially if it's a little thick. My bulky pocket is definitely pushing here, so I'm gonna pull it and kind of flatten it out a little bit. And I'm gonna go behind, just behind this little turn back amount right here. And let's zoom the camera a little closer. All right, so here we are right behind here, and I sort of arrange these. I arrange these layer by layer. So I'm gonna do this layer first, turn it under a little bit, just get it started, and then I do this double layer a little bit. And this one always has this weird little angle, and that's okay, just tuck it in there. I don't start sewing directly on there. Sometimes it's too fiddly, sometimes I do. If it's too fiddly, I'll start behind it a little bit, sort of kind of get going before I get there. Now, your pocket page needs to be managed still. I can feel it under here, so I'm gonna pull it out a little bit, make sure I don't catch it in there. I'm gonna use my awl, and we're just trying to stitch this so that the fold goes just past our stitch line that we just sewed, and our needle is to the right of that stitch line. You can kind of gauge it by looking here. And then it'll fall on the binding on the other side, but if it doesn't, it's not a big deal. It'll still look really nice on the inside. All right, here we are. Make sure you don't sew your pocket page. I'm really pushing hard with my hands. I'm really managing the case and not letting it manage me. Okay, we get a bit of a break here. And now we're approaching our elastic. And again, the case is going to feel really long, so I fold it up. All right, so here we go. We're going to fold these corners in and tug really good. And I'm going to make sure my elastic is perpendicular to the seam here. Brighten it up there a little bit. And now you really want to sew close to the edge of the binding while you're on the elastic. All right, so here we are, right around this corner, and I'm just managing it with my awl. And then doing the same thing, stop, needle down, press your foot up, adjust as I oosh around the corner. All right, pull your elastic out of the way, make sure you don't catch it where you don't want to catch it. And then I'm still managing this corner a little bit. It's kind of getting the best of me now. And again, I'm on this elastic, making sure it's perpendicular to the binding, and I'm sewing really close to the elastic. All right, and we have a bit of a break before we approach our next pocket page. We can kind of pull it out of the way here maybe and keep it pinned. Keep all those threads towards the seam allowance. It'll feel kind of bad, like it feels pretty thick here and like you might be catching something. And remember, that's the fold of the pocket page, and if you have the bulky pocket like I do, you'll feel that as well. Just reassure yourself that you've already made sure you're not going to catch it, and it'll be fine. All right, again, needle down, press your foot up, couple stitches. All right, we made it to the beginning. There we go. All right. That looks really cute. This is probably one of the cutest ones I've made. Look at that. Very cute. Foxes are upside down on the back. That's okay. They're both right side up on the front. Good job sewing your Quickie case. I hope you have a lot of fun filling it, and I hope I get to see your creation. Tag me on Instagram or use the hashtag. And until next time, happy sewing.